introducing the program a little bit more in detail in just a moment. But before we get started, I do want to cover a couple of housekeeping items. If you are in the Zoom space, you are coming in on mute. The program is being recorded, and if you're over on YouTube, none of that matters. However, if you would like to ask a question at any point during the program, if you are in Zoom, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can type your question in there. If you are over on YouTube, you can type it in the chat box. There will be a portion of the program toward the end of our hour together where questions will be taken and answered. So with that, I would like to welcome Betsy Peterson from Beacon Hill Village. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Welcome to you all. My name is Betsy Peterson, as Kristen said, and it's my privilege to welcome you on behalf of Beacon Hill Village. And we too are thrilled with our relationship with the Boston Public Library. Many of you know, some of you may not, the Beacon Hill Village is a member-driven organization that pioneered new ways of bringing resources to older adults. And that model has inspired more than 250 villages all over the US and about 100 more in development. I suspect some people from other villages are here today, so welcome to you especially. The initial focus was to make it easier for us to stay in the homes and the neighborhoods that we love. But now we see a broader vision. We think that the village movement, because it really is a movement, can create opportunities to choose how aging is lived and to change how aging is viewed. So we are especially happy to be welcoming Ashton Applewhite and Judy Foreman today because they too are changing how aging is viewed. Today's program is part of a series, Living Well, Ending Well, offered by Beacon Hill Village. It's our third year and our first year as a partner of the Boston Public Library. And thank you, library. It's been wonderful to use your space, and without you, there could not be so many people here today. So we're grateful for that as well. In a minute, I'll introduce Ashton and Judy, but I also want you to meet Barbara Roop, who is chair of the Living Well Committee. Want to wave, Barbara? Or maybe you're not showing. Barbara is chair of the Living Well Committee, and she'll be managing the questions that you send in during the program. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Judy Foreman. Many of you here in Boston will remember that the Boston Globe used to have a wonderful column called Health Sense. That was Judy's column. It was syndicated nationally and internationally. One column she wrote was about pain and how little attention the medical profession was paying to pain. And there was so much response that she decided to pursue that subject further. So her first book is called A Nation in Pain. The second is on the global pain crisis. Her third book, I'm glad to say, is on a happier topic, which is Exercise is Medicine. And it really is medicine. You'll find out when you read the book. All of those books were published by the Oxford University Press. So Judy, over to you.
Thank you, Bets. I should mention that Betsy and I are in the same book group and we've known each other for a long and wonderful time. Meanwhile, it's my pleasure to introduce Ashton Applewhite, and she is the author of This Chair Rocks, a manifesto against ageism, and I'm sure you can look that up online. She is an internationally recognized expert on ageism, and she speaks a lot at venues that have included the TED main stage and the United Nations. She's written for Harper's, The Guardian, and the New York Times, and she's the voice of Yo, Is This Ageist? She's a leading spokesperson for the emerging movement against discrimination on the basis of age. So without further ado, I'd like to say hi to Ashton and then just get started. So hi, Ashton.
Hi, Judy, and thanks everyone for coming today.
I'm glad for so many people too. So I want to just plunge right in with two kind of a double question. That's a fault of journalists for asking many questions at the same time. What is ageism and what drew you toward that as a topic for study?
The dictionary definition of ageism is discrimination and stereotyping on the basis of age. We are being ageist, and we're all ageist, anytime we make an assumption about a person or a group of people based on how old we think they are. And it's usually that they're too old because we live in a very youth-centric culture, but it can also be too young. Younger people experience ageism too. So truly, we are all, oppressed by it from really childhood on. What drew me to it was I was in my mid-50s. I'm 67 now. I'm turning 68 very soon. I was afraid of getting old. And I'm not an academic, but I'm a nerd and I like to dig into subjects. And so I started researching longevity. And in literally a matter of weeks into what has become now pushing 15-year project, I learned that everything I thought I knew about old age, late life was way off base, way too negative, not nuanced enough, flat out wrong. And I thought, so what got me started was like, why don't we know these things? And a very short answer to that is that if aging is framed as a problem, we can be sold things or persuaded to worry about things that can stop it or fix it. And if aging is framed as a disease, we can be persuaded to buy things to cure it or fix it. And aging is not a problem or a disease. It is a powerful, lifelong process on which every human being embarks the day we're born. It's not even just something annoying old people do.
I'm intrigued, yeah, by what you said a minute ago about ageism affects young people too. How does that work? We think somebody's too young, for instance, too young to be president.
Too young to be president. I mean, to confess my own ageism, I feel like if I haven't been in the hospital much, but we've all been there or been visiting friends, and the doctor walks in the room and she looks like she just got out of high school to me, and I catch myself thinking, "Yikes, you're a doctor." I mean, I know enough now not to assume that he or she is not the doctor, but that is my own age prejudice, thinking, gee, they look too young. And the point is, we blame all kinds of things on age, including sometimes physical problems, when often age has nothing to do with. They could be too inexperienced to be a doctor. They could be too biased. There are all sorts of reasons they might not be a good doctor, but they don't have to do with the person's age.
That's so interesting because years ago when I was at the Boston Globe, I did a whole series on aging, and I spent some time with the Baltimore longitudinal study on aging. And what I learned from that is a lot of things, especially aches and pains that we attribute to aging, when in fact they're actually a genuine medical problem that could and should be addressed.
If we think old people don't sleep as well, the main reason is we do have more aches and pains because things do hurt more, joint pain stuff. That does add up with age. As an arthritic person, I know all about that. But that's not because they're old. That's because they have arthritis.
Right, exactly. That's a really important point. I wanted to ask you kind of a global question. Do you think ageism is a particularly American or Western phenomenon, or does it affect China, Japan? In other words, do we kind of have a more negative view of older people than some other countries?
I think it's more about culture and religion necessarily than countries with a tradition of ancestor worship. Indigenous peoples often do venerate and honor their older members. One thing I like to point out that people makes me not very popular in some circles is that traditional cultures, including early America, which was a gerontocracy, older people, older men, needless to say, ruled the roost. And many other cultures where the oldest son inherited everything. Cultures that are heavily weighted towards older people are lousy places in which to be young. So what we want is a society that values every stage of the life course. I think the real issue here is not so much what country or nationality, rather than capitalism, consumer culture. Everywhere that the value of a human being is reduced to their conventional economic productivity, how much money do they make, rather than all the enormous ways in which older people continue to contribute, but that are much harder to measure, in addition to all the paid work we do. So those are, and also urbanization, where people become age segregated. The younger people move into the cities. Those are huge macroeconomic trends which promote ageism because they separate the generations and they devalue people. So it's really not a question of country to country. It's a question of where are the places where people live in mixed age communities. The US is very age segregated, and we are also a hyper capitalist consumer culture. And that is not our friend either, because if you think your wrinkles are just fine, you are not going to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on miracle creams or Botox or whatever, to pick just one example. So capitalism and consumer culture both propel ageism forward. And I think, and popular culture, of which the US is still the biggest exporter. So I think all those things combine to make the US the sort of queen bee in this competition.
Yeah. It's interesting. I hadn't thought about what you just said about how we're very age segregated, but I think that's really true. And I don't think it's a good thing, because my husband and I just moved into a condo building, and most of the people are more or less our stage of life. Not necessarily our age exactly, but I find I miss the diversity of ages. Like, I'm on a swim team and in a singing group where there are a lot of young people, and I miss that cross-fertilization of younger people and older people. I agree with you that it's a disservice to everybody to not do that.
It's been cool to see a whole bunch of intergenerational initiatives cropping up all over the place, not necessarily coming out of anti-ageism work explicitly, but of course they are inherently anti-ageist, because it's very hard to hold on to your prejudices about a given group, be it younger or older, when you come into contact with them and you experience the fact, of course, that every person is different and that no stereotype is true. So one of the most important things we can do to age well is to make friends of all ages, right? Because the biggest threat to a good old age, heading into this, I thought, well, it's fine if you're healthy. That's not it. Oh, well, then it's fine if you're wealthy. Well, of course, money makes everything easier. And the class bias in all of this goes way too little discussed, in my opinion. But the most important component is a good social network. And as we age, our networks do tend to shrink, especially if we leave work. Friends we've known all our lives die. So find something you like to do. Singing is a great example, or gardening, or these days, political activism, whatever it happens to be, and find a mixed age group to do it with. And that way you will keep your contacts going. And frankly, younger people who are in contact with older people who see how much we enjoy a lot about being older, it's much harder for them then to have this sort of knee-jerk, everything about getting old is going to be awful.
Well, it's interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking about one of the things I learned about when I was researching my book, which is something called the grandmother effect. And in certain societies, older people tends to often be women, grandmothers, but it can be grandfathers too. There's wisdom that older people have that can literally save the tribe or their family when times get tough. And I actually saw this when I went to cover the hantavirus epidemic in New Mexico, and it was the tribal elders who associated an uptick in pinon trees, which fed a bunch of rats, which left feces, which got aerosolized, which made everybody sick. And the doctors wouldn't have known that had they not talked to the elders.
Yeah.
So I'd like you to comment on I know wisdom is a tricky word, but what particular value do people who are older have to contribute to society?
It depends on the person. I'll make myself unpopular again and say, not all old people are wise. There are quite a few that don't seem to have learned a thing along the way, but most of us, we are certainly more experienced, and most of us do learn from that experience. And I think that is the basis of a lot of wisdom, although we've all met the wise child, right? With that shiver of recognition. The grandmother thing is really interesting. It goes back to a hypothesis, back to the Paleolithic era, when humans started, Homo sapiens emerged and began living long enough to have 3 generations. And that is when art happened. That's when music happened. That's when civilization, as we name it, started to emerge. And the theory is because of exactly what you say, Judy, that that knowledge began to be passed down accumulated and passed down through the generations. So of course, older people do have that. And we see that in indigenous cultures a lot, where older people really are revered as repositories of welcome. The printing press was terrible for old people because they started storing that stuff in books, but I can't say that I'm sorry that reading and writing got invented.
Well, interesting. It's not
especially in an event hosted by the Boston Public Library.
right. It's interesting because it's not just humans who have this grandmother effect. Whales and elephants and other sort of advanced species do too. But I wanted to ask you, how does ageism how do we know when someone is being ageist toward, or we're feeling ageist toward ourselves? Is it when people ask you what year you graduated from college, or what are some of the subtle ways in which people use ageism to kind of put people in boxes?
Well, age is a category, and it is a legitimate category. The question is, why is someone asking the question? I mean, if someone asks you when you graduated from college, think about how you feel in response to that question. The most important step is to look at our own attitudes towards age and aging. We are brainwashed bombarded by negative messages, starting with children's books, you know, the passive grannies and the cranky granddads, and don't get me started on Disney movies, and so on up, and then on to the omission of older people from the media, from advertising, from billboards, from popular culture. So unless we stop to question those messages, they become part of our identity. So the hardest job of all is to look and see, you know, am I blaming? I mean, it's you know, do I blame my, in my TED talk, I say I stop blaming my sore knee on being 65 because my other knee doesn't hurt and it's just as old, right?
Right.
Do you, you know, do you get or send a birthday card that says something totally, I mean, the birthday card aisle in your corner drugstore is repellent. And a really good litmus test is, would you ever make a comment or buy a card that foregrounded a analogous thing that had to do with who I sleep with or what my color of my skin is? Right?
That's a great point. Yeah. Next time I go to the birthday card aisle, I would think of, but I like your other point a lot too, that, you know, one knee hurts and one doesn't, but we tend to blame everything on aging. And it's medically stupid as well as psychologically bad.
I mean, people say, even when you think if you ever use, like, again, look first at yourself. Do you ever say, I'm too old for that?
Yes.
You might be too lazy for that. You might be too out of shape for that. You might be too smart for that. You might just not want to do it, but age is very, very rarely the reason. So start to check the way you use the words old and young.
Well, do
you really mean, you know, I feel so young? You probably mean you feel sexy or you feel with it, right? We'll use that because lots of older people are sexy and with it, and lots of younger people might not be.
That's so true. And what you're sort of getting at is the importance of language. I mean, words matter. When I wrote an aging column for the Globe many years, when I was younger.
Don't tell us how many.
That was on purpose. Many years ago. And I thought, how do I refer to older people? I hate the word elderly, and I banned it from the Boston Globe. That was a little triumph. But you have a point in your book about using people first language. And as a medical writer, I was very aware of that. We don't say AIDS victims, they're people with AIDS or women with breast cancer, as opposed to cancer victims or something. Yeah. Well, how does that apply to older people? I mean, I find the term older people not offensive in a way that I find the term elderly offensive. So what's the difference?
Yeah. Well, the term the elderly, I just tweeted about this morning, we should put a silver stake through its heart forever, partly because of its ageist connotations. Very old should not mean frail and incapacitated, but it does have that regrettable association, which is not its fault. It's the fault of the culture. My biggest issue with elderly is that it is usually paired with the. And when you refer to everyone over 65 as the elderly, you imply that we belong to some homogenous group. If I could, you know, zap a single fact into the mind of everyone in the world to end ageism, it would be the fact that the longer we live, the more different from one another we become. A group of 60 to 70-year-olds is way more diverse than a group of 20 to 30-year-olds, right? So that's part of the problem. When I was writing my book, I literally got tired of typing older people or older Americans. And I have a shorthand. And as a writer, I am very leery of neologisms. The English language has tens and tens and tens of thousands of really wonderful words, but I started using olders and youngers as nouns. And I can see you making a face because you're a writer and a journalist, but here's the thing, here is my case for it. When I say, refer to olders, people know, they know what it means. And when you have olders and youngers, we are both, you and I are both. We relate to people older than us and younger than us. So it busts down that old young spectrum, which, like black and white, like mobile and immobile, like dependent and independent, those binaries do not exist. And they segregate us and they fill us with needless dread. A 4-year-old will assure you that she is older than her 2-year-old sister. So it emphasizes the fact that we age in relation to each other. But if you won't use olders, I think older people and younger people is the best substitute.
Yeah, certainly whenever you say the category, it's dismissive of everything.
It's a problem. I mean, as for, you can say people with age, just like we say people with, I'll tell you who broke me of the habit was a friend who works with people with disabilities. He said, would you say your cancerous mother?
No.
And I never made that mistake again. So, but I think if we didn't live in an ageist world, old itself would not be an ugly word, right? We should claim old, but that's another reason to use older is that a lot of us, and me too, I don't generally, sometimes I say I'm old, but I'm really readily say I'm older. I mean, if there's more road behind you than ahead, you're older. So it's a lot easier for a lot of us to identify as older than as old, which has a certain sort of binary finality to it that I think is not our friend.
Yes, and of course we're all older than we were yesterday, so it's all relative. I wanted to ask you. You go a lot into some of the economic facets of aging, and one question: are older workers more expensive for a company than younger workers, or are younger workers cheaper? I mean, I've often thought that people think that, well, older people are, they're getting too big salaries. If you bring in a younger person, they're cheaper, even if they don't know as much. What's your take on all that?
You can find any statistic you want to suit the argument you want to make. As we move through life, we generally get increases in our salary because hopefully we know more and become more valuable to whatever enterprise we're working at. Younger people cost less money, but they change jobs more often. And by the way, I can't resist saying that the trope that, millennials, now I guess it's, Gen Z, they're not dependable. They change jobs all the time. We change jobs too all the time when we were their age, right? It's ageist to say it's the fault of people who are 30 or 40, right? If you're 65, your employer doesn't have to pay for healthcare anymore. We have Medicare. A lot of older people don't want to work full time anymore. We're making them less expensive. It depends on how you slice and dice it. But it is certainly an argument that is used erroneously to let a lot of older people go, as is, and this really is a myth, the idea that older people take jobs away from younger people. Yeah. In academia, where there's only a very few fixed number of tenure positions, it's true, but in the narrowest sense. But in general, if there not enough jobs, then you might have everyone in town competing for the one job at the soda fountain or the UPS store. But that is a labor market problem, not a too many old people problem. In general, the number of jobs expands as the economy expands, and older and younger people don't compete for the same jobs.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's called the fallacy of the lump of labor.
Yeah, yes, I remember that term in your book. One of the other things that stood out to me when reading your book was the percent of Americans over 65 living in nursing homes.
Right.
When you posed that question, I sort of paused and made a guess myself. And I thought, okay, it's probably about 20%. And you say it's only 2.5%. First of all, where did you get that number? And why, if that's true, then why is our perception so crazy?
I love that you beam right down on that. When I did my TED Talk, which was in 2016, which is not that long ago, the percentage was 4.5%. It has fallen that much since then. I do not remember the attribution right now, but it's like the NIH or something. I mean, it's a totally blue chip source, and I'm happy to send it to you afterwards. And every fact in my book is footnoted up the wazoo. That was back to when 15 years ago, when I started researching longevity, one of my assumptions was, I think I would have said 20 to 30%. The odds of ending up in a nursing home are pretty damn good. And that's just not the case. And the number is falling partly because of initiatives like the village to village movement, partly because although as we live longer, there are more, disease isn't going away, but we are learning to manage it better. Of that 2.5% in nursing homes, by far, if there was a curve, the odds increase, the age increases with home, but even at 85, most people live, I don't say independently anymore, we live interdependently. I would like to take the word independent out of everything to do with aging and living, because none of us are independent ever. And I think it makes us cling to some false, expensive, and unattainable standard. But this specter that we're going to live in nursing homes is fed by the fears of an ageist culture. Sometimes I say I'm in the both sides of the story business. It is not that our fears about aging are without basis. I am not a Pollyanna, running out of money, ending up alone, up in a horrible institution. It's that our fears are way out of proportion to the reality. And that fear itself is bad for us. One data point I'll toss out is Alzheimer's. Most people's darkest fear, certainly mine, dementia. What we do, and it's a terrible disease, and we don't know how to fix it or even diagnose it, but the rate of Alzheimer's is falling fast. There are more cases in an absolute sense because there's more older people in the audience, in the population, and age is the greatest risk factor. But the odds of anyone listening to this getting Alzheimer's have been getting lower and lower and lower over the last few decades, and people are being diagnosed at later ages. So it's not that it's not an issue, it's that the anxiety, the worry is bad for us. Can I add one more thing onto that?
Absolutely.
The latest study out of Yale, a fantastic researcher named Becca Levy, she's the one who does a lot of research on how attitudes towards aging affect how our minds and bodies function. People with, the media usually frames it as a positive attitude towards aging. I like to say a fact rather than fear-based attitude towards aging, because it's not some happy talk graywashing thing, right? People with a fact rather than fear-based attitude towards aging are less likely to get Alzheimer's, even if they have the gene that predisposes them to the disease.
And I'd like to add on to that too, with a plug for exercise, because one of the facts that I won't say stumbled upon, that I sought out for my book, there was no stumbling upon things, was from an Ontario study that said if everyone who is currently inactive became active physically, we could reduce 1 in every 7 cases of Alzheimer's. So
wow.
Just a plug for exercise.
The theory is it just moves more oxygen around your brain. Is that why?
No, I don't know if we should go into it or not, but exercise stimulates this chemical in the brain called BDNF, which stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which literally makes new neurons grow in the hippocampus. So that may be more than people wanted to know right now, but it's very powerful. It's a very powerful preservative for cognition. Before we go to general questions, I want you to talk a little bit about this U-shaped happiness curve, because that's kind of a rosy, nice view. I read a little bit about it after I read your book, and it sounds like it may be somewhat controversial, but what is the U-shaped happiness curve, and how do we explain it?
Well, that was another one of those things that I learned very early on, along with the data about nursing homes, was that people are happiest at the beginnings and the ends of their lives. And that's why it's called the U curve of happiness. And I'm surprised to hear you say it's controversial, because it has been borne out by dozens of studies in the US and around the globe. And when I heard it, I can't tell you how skeptical I was. I thought they must have cornered two octogenarians and given them a cookie and said, "How are you doing?" And then I thought, well, that must be true if you're wealthy, or it must be true if you're wealthy. It obtains across class, across nationalities, across cultures. Where I will say that what I worry about is as we live longer, and this, let's say this is 85, I do worry about at the very end it going down like that. Not because the curve, by the way, is a function of the way aging itself affects the healthy brain. We older people enjoy better mental health. We're better able to roll with the punches. We're better able to prioritize the big stuff from the little stuff. So that's why it exists. I worry that as we live longer, if we don't get better at talking about dying, and at addressing, no one wants to live have a gruesome death, hooked up to machines, or years of really profound medical disability, physical and mental impairment. That said, I also think it's important to point out that we live in a deeply ageist and ableist culture, prejudiced against people with disabilities. We grossly underestimate the quality of life of very old people and people with disabilities, who are often one and the same, and that at any age and in any condition, people have the right to want to stay alive. So, it's a complicated dance, but I think part of the reason it's important to talk about aging and ageism is to become more comfortable with talking about ableism. I believe you said you knew Ellen Goodman, who started the Conversation Project.
Yes. Let me just, for people who may have forgotten, both Ellen and I are now retired from the Globe, but when she retired, she and a medical ethicist whom I also know, and a couple of other people started this thing called the Conversation Project, which is basically urging people of all ages, actually, but especially as you get older, to have the conversation, which means talking with your loved ones about what you would like in your later years, including healthcare proxy stuff. What interventions, if any, do you want? When do you want them started? When do you want them stopped? What is your living will? And what's important to you? People sometimes call it an ethical will. What are your values that you'd like to pass on to your kids? Yeah. It's very, very hard to have that conversation. I mean, especially when who wants to do it at Thanksgiving or Christmas or Hanukkah or something. But it's really important because especially now with coronavirus and people are trying to make decisions, do you want to be on a ventilator or not? When do you have that conversation and with whom? And do you write it down and go for it?
I do reference the Conversation Project in my book. It's fantastic. I love pointing out that their questions are on Zoom. They operate, whether you're the person who wants to initiate the conversation with someone who is perhaps older or more debilitated, or you're the older person who wants to initiate it. It works both ways. And the questions are not like, do you want them to pull the plug or not? But are you worried about more intervention, too little or too much? So again, it's not binary.
That's
a really important point is that these conversations need to be held ideally on a regular basis. The worst part is having the first one. Everyone feels so much better. That's the unexpected part. You're like, oh, that wasn't so terrible, and I feel much better. You look under the bed at the monster, yes, there's a monster. You're gonna die. You're gonna die of something. But just looking is a huge weight off people, right? And I had the conversation with my kids and rushed through it in about 30 seconds. And it was sort of like, okay, pull the plug. And my son said, Ma, what if you're hit by a taxi outside the front door? And I said, I want that liver transplant. He said, Ma, that would be an extreme intervention. And my physician helped me too. She's like, no, you don't need a DNR. Do not resuscitate. You are too active. And she probably said too young. But what I want now may be different from what I want. If I get coronavirus, I wrote a piece about it. I write about this. I have a blog, thischairrocks.com/blog, about how in this time of such paralyzing uncertainty on so many fronts, one of the things we can't exercise control over is how we think we might want to die, which hopefully will be, those papers will sit, not used for 20 or 30 more years or 30 or 40 more years. But exercising our wishes, expressing our wishes, gives us control. There's a great phrase by a Dutch gerontologist, Jan Bars: autonomy requires collaborators. Say what you want and say who you would like to help you. And that is what will help you and them later on.
I have a whole lot more questions, but I think our audience does too. So Barbara Roop, if you're there and available, can you unmute yourself and let me know if you have some questions from the people who've been listening?
We do have some questions, and I'd be happy to read them out for you.
Okay.
Let's see, from Susie Lane on YouTube. I am writing a book on menopause and the stigma around this powerful time of a woman's life. Where do you think the ultimate problem lies with stigma being attached to this transition? Medical practices, society in general, family teaching?
I think it's always society in general. I think so. I mean, I think this is with the whole conversation around Black Lives Matter and police brutality. What emerged very soon was, yes, it's a problem that police treat Black people in their custody worse than white people, but that the problem is systemic. The problem is racist policies and attitudes. I think the silence around menopause has to do with patriarchy and misogyny, which frankly goes back to that time when we let the matriarchy slip out of our grasp, ladies. I forget when that was, but it was a long time ago. It was a terrible mistake. And this idea that women's bodies are that menstruation is a dirty time, that women are never the right age, we are never the right shape, and we spend all this money and effort. Women buy 80% of self-help books. Right? Women spend much more on, beauty stuff. You know all this. And of course, this addresses the intersection of ageism and sexism, right? This horrible double whammy, the double standard of aging, Susan Sontag, the critic, called it. So it shows up, I think, in menopause. The real reason menopause is so stigmatized is because of ageism. If we cease to be fertile, health research on women around the world, this is a generalization, but it's from the World Health Organization, pretty much stops being carried out at 55 because we cease to be reproductively useful.
Can I chime in on the research?
So just to finish the point, the whole silence around menopause has to do with these vast social and economic forces around sexism, patriarchy, ageism, and misogyny.
Just to stick in a point about research on women, when I was doing my pain book, one of the most egregious things I found out was that even in animal studies with rats, they don't like to study females because they get their period. And that makes it complicated, but half the world is complicated. So, I mean, there's been a huge push to add female rats to the research agenda.
And more older people in clinical trials. All these things replicate and echo out, of course.
And children in clinical trials too. Barbara, do you have some more questions?
Yes, actually, this is an interesting one from Mary Hirsch. As a Californian, I need to ask, Ashton, at 67, you look fabulous. Have you had cosmetic help? I'm all for it. Now, my addition here is that an ageist question?
Yes.
It's looksist. It emphasizes the idea that how we look is the most important thing about us, which of course is something seldom leveled at men. Yes, you can see everything wrinkles as it used to. I'm the only woman in the world who put the gray in her hair because I figured no one believed me that it was actually brown. And now that I've been 6 months without a trip to the hairdresser, you can see that I do have some gray. So I'm glad I look good, but to accept the compliment, which is hard not to, it's a really hard habit to break, would be to do two things: to reinforce the fundamentally basic ageist idea that younger is better. And also it implies that there's a certain way to look at 67. and that, I can only accept it to reinforce that idea. And I can't do that. I broke the habit.
Yeah. I think it was Gloria Steinem who went to Botswana or someplace in Africa at 80. And I think she said, this is what 80 looks like. We do have so many misconceptions.
She famously said, this is what 40 looks like when she was 40, which was quoted on her 80th birthday in the New York Times, which published a big picture of her when she was 40 to accompany her 80th birthday, which pissed me off.
I don't blame you. I'm surprised about that. Barbara, I have a lot more questions, but do you have some more?
I have another one. Is the term senior citizen offensive to adults?
Do you want to be called it? If it offends you, then it's offensive. I mean, we are each entitled to do these things in our own way. If you use Botox, if you dye your hair to cover the gray, if that makes you feel comfortable and powerful and happy in your own skin, more power to you. This is complicated, especially for women. No judgment. And it's same that, one of the reasons I don't like elderly is because I've never heard anyone describe themselves as elderly. I don't hear people use senior citizen, not so much, it's sort of yucky more than offensive. I'm not quite sure why. I don't call myself, and mature kind of sounds like I think it sounds like Ensure to me, like a dietary supplement. But I don't use the word elder either, but it is a valuable word in indigenous cultures. African American communities use it. It's a gorgeous, beautiful word. Use whatever works for you.
I have a question that I got triggered by your book. Is retirement a thing of the past? Is that still a stage of life, or are we in a post-retirement phase of humans?
Well, retirement itself is a pretty new thing. It happened along with industrialization and then eventual and urbanization and the 40-hour work week and so on. And then people started living longer. What really happened in the 20th century was that lifespan took this tremendous leap. Certainly conventional retirement, first of all, was only available to the privileged to start with, and to a pretty small percentage of the population. So the idea that you study for the first third of your life and then you work for the first, second, third, and then you relax at the end is definitely obsolete. Most of us don't want to do that. An awful lot of us can't afford it anyway. We're developing, but the economy is also changing for younger people. It's changing for everyone, right? The gig economy. And, I hope that the COVID epidemic, I certainly hope it will bring along universal health care. Perhaps it'll bring along universal basic income. Perhaps it will provide some way to provide more security. I certainly hope so, for essential workers defined in the broadest sense, because we are all now becoming members of this globalized gig economy. And that, as much as population aging, is transforming the idea of retirement.
I'd like to go back to something you said earlier about not liking the word or the concept of independence in later life. And I guess it's fair to say most people do not really want to go to a nursing home. Maybe assisted living or continuing care is a somewhat different category. But for people who want to age at home, as you become a bit less able to manage things physically, but you want to maintain your independence, who helps you out then? You said it's kind of a collaborative thing.
Yeah, I'm making a slightly semantic point that I would like to take it out of the whole picture, because we all need help lifelong. Obviously, we need help when we are children. Obviously, we need help when we have little children. I feel like that's when I needed the most help. Now, I am not strong enough to do a lot of the things I used to do. So binaries, again, are never our friend. We don't go from not needing any help to becoming helpless and needing help with everything. So that's what I mean, that I would like to get rid of this binary of this idea that there's some point at which you become old, you become immobile, you become helpless, because we all need more help as we go along, and the terms are going to change, and we're going to have, less control perhaps over what we need help with. But if we can destigmatize the asking and remind ourselves what we do know, which is that asking and giving help are two-way transactions that are hugely rewarding to the giver as well. I mean, there's a cheesy exercise, I saw at a conference that I went to where the person in the front of the room asked everyone who liked to help people to raise their hand, and then asked everyone who liked to receive help to raise their hand. Right. And one, we don't because of the stigma. So if we can destigmatize it, it would be, there's a real function for nursing homes. Nursing homes provide skilled nursing care, and some of us will need that, just as some people with severe illness and disability do now, who may be completely cognitively with it. Let's destigmatize that. Let's destigmatize Alzheimer's, people living with Alzheimer's, right? Who are now progressive people are working much harder to keep them in the community. The disability justice movement has been working for decades to give people with disabilities ways to live in community. Let's live in diverse communities across age and ability, and hopefully, race and class too, so that we're in contact with all different kinds of people, and we don't have to fear this moment of, oh my God, I'm going to be taken somewhere where I won't be able to choose what I eat, what time I go to bed, what I listen to, which I agree is a grim prospect.
It is. Barbara, do you have some more questions?
I do have a couple. There's one of the folks in the audience belongs to an organization, Old Lesbians Organizing for Change. And one of the ways they help members get over self-consciousness about aging is to ask everybody to introduce themselves either by our age or year of birth. What do you think about that?
I love that idea. I gave a talk, I'm laughing because I gave a talk in Beverly Hills a while ago, and was talking with the organizer beforehand about how to do the Q&A and announce icebreaker. And I said chirpily, well, we could have it was mostly women. I think it was entirely women, actually. I think it was a women's organization. And I said, well, we could have everyone say how old they were when they asked a question. And she said, honey, this is Beverly Hills. We need to have ambulances lined out front. I think it would be a great idea. You touch on a really, it's always complicated. There's always two sides to things. Do we want to lead with our age, or do we want to say my age is, I have radical friends who won't give their age, not because they're ashamed of it, but because they don't want to be pigeonholed in the way they fear, with reason, that giving their age would lead to. Both, there's not a right or wrong here. I'd like to see age taken out of newspaper stories, unless it's an obituary, because we used to put race in and we took it out for the same reason. If you don't know exactly how old that person is, why do we need to know? We need to know because we want to know, we want to categorize it, me too, but it's often so that we can make stereotypical assumptions about age. I do know of Old Lesbians Organizing for Change, and let me just mention that it is one of the many anti-ageist resources that is listed on a website called Old School, oldschool.info, which is a clearinghouse of free, vetted anti-ageism resources. Organizations like OLOC, videos, workshops, PowerPoints, public speakers, and everything on it is free except the books. And I like to point out that if you have any doubt that a movement against ageism is underway, go to the campaigns section of Old School, which is one of our fastest growing sections, and is filled with examples of not how to be healthy, not how to live forever, how to combat ageism between your ears, in your community, in your country, right?
That's a perfect segue into another question I have about what are the educational resources or public platforms being used to inform our youth about respecting the wisdom and traditions of the aging. If discrimination and disrespect is being taught at home, how can these platforms provide a launch for educating?
Well, I created Old School with 2 colleagues because movements need tools. So I think you'll find a ton of stuff there. I would say that the most important, the most social, all change, as the saying goes, starts within, starts between our ears. Just if we want to participate in the Black Lives Matter movement, we need to look at our own internalized racism. If we want to be anti-ageist, we need to look at our own attitudes towards age and aging. And the women's movement used consciousness raising as its tool. And one of the things I created early on is, and it's a free download from my website and on Old School, called Who Me, Ageist? How to Start a Consciousness Raising Guide Around Age Bias. Because what consciousness raising did, women came together and compared stories and realized that the things that they had been experiencing as personal problems, not getting hired, getting harassed, not being respected, were not personal problems. They were widely shared social and economic problems that required collective action and that we could come together and do something about. And that is exactly what we need to do around age. The people with disabilities say it this beautifully. The problem is not that I'm in a wheelchair. The problem is that there are stairs between me and where I want to go. The problem is not that I have wrinkles, which I do. The problem is that I live in a society that discriminates against me on that basis. So that's the first step. And then there's all sorts of workshops on Old School and tools, ways, dozens and dozens of ways you can take that message out in a way and format that suits you.
Can I jump in with a question about politics? Obviously, we're in a campaign season, and we do have 2 white men probably competing against each other. I think they're both 78 or close to. We had a candidate, Pete Buttigieg, who was, I think, 37, 35, something like that. How is age going to be a factor, do you think, in the upcoming election? Or will it?
You know, it's there. I mean, it's less apparent if you have 2 candidates of the same age, whatever that age happens to be. You know, Buttigieg had some really horrible phrase that was like, that amounted to, it's on, Yo, Is This Ageist, by the way, you can find 2 on my site. It's a Q&A blog where you can send in something you've seen or heard and get my take on whether or not it's ageist. And he basically said, get rid of all the old people, which is not okay. You would not say get rid of all the women. You would not say get rid of all the Black people, right? So
I really question whether he actually said that.
He wanted the slate to be all young. He thought that older people did not belong on the slate. And I'll look it up and I'll send it to you happily. I don't mean to misrepresent him, but the problem with any candidate is only what's between their ears and how they act on it. There was a ton of stuff, for example, just the other day about Trump walking very slowly down the ramp from his West Point talk. And there was a ton of stuff about how, you know, is he enfeebled? Is he disabled? That's not okay. It's not okay. There's plenty of really good reasons, in my opinion, to take issue with what Donald Trump says and does, but his age is not part of it, and his ability should not be part of it, and even his race contributes to privilege that now enables him to, carry out racist, in my opinion, racist policies without them harming him or, a lot of his supporters. But we should support or attack candidates and everyone else on the basis of their character and their ideas, and race and ability and age and gender should have nothing to do with it.
Barbara, do you have some more questions?
I think you've pretty much covered the other. There's a question for both you and Ashton.
You go,
do either of you have recommendations for including policymakers in the conversation about ageism and shifting the language we use?
Yeah, I mean, as we sort of talked before, language really is important. It's important in medicine. I mean, I'm thinking of a friend of mine who was diagnosed with an incompetent cervix, which is a literal medical phrase. And no one would ever say someone has an incompetent penis. I mean, it's erectile dysfunction. We danced around all these things. So
Yeah.
language really does matter. And Ashton, as you were talking, I was thinking about some of the language that sort of subtly ages, like we need fresh faces or we need new voices. I mean, we do, but that is subtly ageist. So how do you talk about this stuff without feeling or being or sounding ageist? I mean, I think that, or mainly being ageist is probably.
Well, I think, we muddle through, we figure it out, that language is a moving target and you are never going to get it right all the time. I'm pretty clear on my thoughts on age, but race is much trickier for me. And I am really trying to work a lot harder about to get over that, because my clumsiness or embarrassment is of no help to people of color. So the best thing you can do is think about what the words you're using and interrogate yourself. And, if you get it wrong, ask, try to call it out. If you hear or say something ageist, if you hear it, a really good thing, all-purpose comment is like, why would you assume that? Are you still working? Why do you ask? Or, what do you mean by that? Is it even less you don't want to put someone on the defensive. In terms of the question about policy, I will say that the last chapter of my book is called Occupy Age. And it is about all the ways we can occupy our own age, and then a bunch of suggestions for policy and programs, like giving the Elder Justice Act some teeth, for example. There are tons and tons of things. Aging is huge. Aging is living. Living is aging. There is no topic of public policy, of health, of education, of transportation, of anything, of ethics, of sociology, where aging is irrelevant, right? So bring your expertise to bear, and on whatever topic that you're most interested in, or where you have it in, and look to see, is that policy benefiting people of all ages? And don't leave young people out of it. Young people need help too. It's hard being young.
You're reminding me of a column from many years ago by John Kenneth Galbraith. It was called The Still Syndrome. Are you still working? Are you still alive? Are you still, when you ask that question, it's kind of, there's an internal surprise. You're still working?
Right, that's another really tough habit to break, but unless it has to do with an extreme physical activity. Yes, older people are still having sex, still driving, still running marathons. Try and pull it away. And every time something is hard, every time it's uncomfortable, that's a sign that we are actually working to break out of habituated ways of thinking. And that is the hardest work of all and the most necessary.
I have to say, one of the biggest uppers I had writing my book on exercise was I interviewed a lot of older athletes, and they were every time I'd interview one of them, I was just on a high for a few days. There are older people are the fastest growing segment of the running community.
I'm not surprised.
There are people who do marathons and Ironman marathons and ski things, and swimming. There's a woman I talked to who's trying to do the 7 ocean swim, swimming in all the big oceans in the world. People are much more physically capable than they think. It's astounding. I mean, just with this virus and the quarantine and everything, I haven't been able to swim in my usual pools because the pools have been closed. And to my surprise, I've gone back to jogging with double knee pads on both knees and much slower. But I thought, oh, wow.
You're still running.
Exactly. Still.
You're running nevertheless.
That's right.
I just want to say, though, that those athletes are fantastic and wonderful and admirable and set an incredible example for us. But it's important to remember that they are outliers.
Yes.
And that not all of us can do that, want to do that, can afford to do that, are fit enough to do that. A huge huge piece of ageism is ableism, prejudice against people
Yeah.
with disabilities. And this just came, I've known that for a long time. I've talked about it, but when the early message about COVID came in, don't worry, it's only going to kill old people and
Right.
sick people. I thought, wow, now is the time to walk the walk. If we had known that the virus was also going to affect young people and healthy people, we the world would not be in the tremendous, mess it is now. We would have acted much sooner. So I think this is difficult, but we need, if we took the fear, the stigma of the reduction of physical capacity, which is inevitable. Cognitive decline is not inevitable. Physical decline is. If we joined forces with the disability justice community, which is amazing, right? And took that stigma out, what would we be left with, and how much of stigma, there's stigma from the people in the disability community are ageist, of course, because everyone is. Suppose getting old was destigmatized. Think how we could think of how the hill would be less steep and how we could support each other.
On that very rousing note, I think we have to wind it up pretty soon. So I will pass this to Betsy Peterson. Betsy, are you there?
I'm here, but somehow my video won't go back on.
Well, you sound great.
So let me see. Let me try again. Nope.
Okay.
Well, I have. So I'm gonna.
We hear you.
There we go.
There you are.
I've still got a big screen. There we go. Thank you both so much. That was really fascinating conversation and so much to think about and some very new suggestions and ideas and resources. And among the resources, this chair rocks, a manifesto against ageism. And Ashton's website is thischairrocks.com. And I also highly recommend this one, Exercises Medicine, and Judy's website is judyforeman.com. So that was fabulous. Thank you. I want to mention that the Living Well series will continue. We have another event on July 15th in which Dr. Beth Frades will give a talk on managing stress in time of COVID. Very relevant. That information, the calendar is already on the Beacon Hill Village website, and it will be on the BPL site too, eventually. We have some wonderful things lined up for next fall. One program on the savvy telepatient, Dr. Edward Benz on cancer treatment, Dr. Joanne Manson on nutrition. These are names that many of you will recognize. Those will be online. The library is not considering anything in person until, I think, January at the earliest. So check the websites to keep in touch with these. And thanks to all of you for being here today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.